The gavel had not even finished its final knock when Alina Whitfield felt the floor of her small world crack open. She stood outside the courthouse doors, papers clutched to her chest, the cold morning air biting through her thin coat. The bank had given her family flower shop 30 days. 30 days to pay what she did not have, or lose the only thing her late mother had left her. She was so lost in the numbers spinning through her head that she did not see the black car pull up beside her, or the tall man who stepped out of it until he was standing directly in front of her, blocking the wind. "You dropped this," he said, holding out a folded paper that had slipped from her stack. Alina looked up, startled. The man was impossibly composed, dressed in a dark coat that looked like it cost more than her shop's monthly rent, his eyes a cool, assessing gray. There was something distant about him, as if he were watching the world from behind glass. "Thank you," she said, taking the paper quickly, ready to walk away. "You were at the foreclosure hearing," he said. "It was not a question." Alina stiffened. "Is that any of your business?" "It could be," he said. "I am Alexander Ashworth. I have a proposal that might interest you." She almost laughed. A stranger in an expensive coat offering her a proposal outside a courthouse on the worst morning of her life. "I don't have time for whatever this is." £30,000, he said simply, "for 30 days of your time." That stopped her. She turned back, studying him properly now, searching for the trick, the catch, the reason a man like this would say something so absurd to a stranger. "What exactly do you want from me?" "A wife," he said, "a temporary one." Alina's mouth fell open before she caught herself. "Excuse me." Alexander did not smile, did not soften the strangeness of his own words. "My grandmother's will requires that I marry within 30 days, or I lose my family's estate to a cousin who would run it into the ground within a year. I do not have time to find someone I trust, and I have no interest in a real marriage. I need someone convincing. Someone who can play the part in front of family and lawyers and then walk away when it is finished." "You're serious," Alina said slowly. "I am always serious." She should have walked away. Every instinct told her this man was trouble, that nothing about strangers offering large sums of money for strange favors ever ended simply. But she thought of the shop, of the dried flowers in the window that her mother had arranged herself, of the quiet apartment above it that held every memory she had left. £30,000 would not just save the shop, it would give her a future. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you looked like someone who needed a way out," he said, "and because you are a stranger to my world. No connections, no complications. When this ends, you disappear and no one asks questions." Alina wrapped her arms around herself, thinking of every warning her mother had ever given her about trusting people who seemed too polished, too certain. But desperation has its own logic, and hers was screaming louder than caution. "I need to think," she said. "You have until tomorrow morning," Alexander said, handing her a card with nothing but a phone number printed on it. "After that, I will find another solution." He walked back to his car without another word, leaving Alina standing on the pavement with a stranger's card in her hand, and a decision that would change everything. That night she sat at her kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills, staring at the card until the numbers on it blurred. She thought about her mother, who used to say that some doors only open once. She thought about the shop, the flowers, the life she had built from almost nothing, and she thought about the fact that she had absolutely nothing left to lose. At 6 in the morning, before she could talk herself out of it, she called the number. "I'm in," she said before he could even say hello, "but I have conditions." There was a pause on the other end, and for the first time she heard something close to surprise in his voice. "I am listening." "No one gets hurt because of this," she said. "Not me, not you, not anyone else. And when the 30 days are over, I walk away with my money and my life, no strings." "Agreed," Alexander said. "I will send a car for you within the hour. We marry today." Alina's stomach dropped. Today. The clock is already running, Miss Whitfield. There is no time to waste. She hung up the phone and stood in the middle of her small kitchen, heart pounding, wondering if she had just made the best decision of her life or the worst one. Outside, the sun was rising over the street where she had grown up, and somewhere across the city, a car was already being sent to take her into a world she knew nothing about. By noon, Alina was standing in a registry office she had never seen before, wearing a simple ivory dress that had been delivered to her that morning by a woman who introduced herself only as Grace, Alexander's assistant. The dress fit as if it had been made for her, which unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Alexander stood beside her, unreadable as ever, dressed in a dark suit that made him look even more like a man carved from stone. There were no guests, no flowers, no music. Just a registrar reading words that Alina barely absorbed, and Alexander's hand, cool and steady, slipping a ring onto her finger. "You may kiss the bride," the registrar said, and for one suspended moment, Alina wondered if he actually would. He did not. He simply nodded at the registrar, thanked her, and turned to Alina with the same composed expression he had worn since the moment they met. "That was easier than expected," he said, as if they had just completed a business transaction, which, in every sense that mattered, they had. "Glad it met your expectations," Alina said dryly, and for the briefest second something flickered in his eyes. Not quite a smile, but close. Outside, the car was waiting to take them to Ravensworth Manor, the estate Alina had only ever seen in old photographs in newspapers left behind at the shop. As the city gave way to rolling countryside, she watched the world change outside her window, and could not shake the feeling that her own life had just changed just as completely. "There are things you need to understand before we arrive," Alexander said, breaking the silence. "I'm listening." "My staff does not know this is temporary. Neither does my family. As far as anyone at the manor is concerned, we met 8 months ago, fell in love, and married quickly because I did not want to wait. You will need to be convincing." "I can be convincing," Alina said, though her heart was pounding at the size of the lie she had just agreed to live inside. "There is one more thing," Alexander said, his voice lower now. "My cousin Nathaniel will not accept this easily. He has wanted the estate for years, and he will look for any reason to prove our marriage is not real. If he succeeds, I lose everything, and so do you." Alina turned to look at him fully for the first time since they had left the registry office. Beneath the composure, she thought she saw something else. Not fear exactly, but the weight of a man who had been carrying too much alone for too long. "Then we won't let him succeed," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. Alexander studied her for a long moment, as if recalculating something in his mind. "You are not what I expected, Miss Whitfield." "It's Mrs. Ashworth now," Alina said, testing the name on her tongue for the first time. "Apparently." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but the ghost of one. "Apparently," he agreed. The car turned down a long drive lined with ancient trees, and Ravensworth Manor rose into view, all gray stone and tall windows, more imposing than anything Alina had ever seen in person. She felt her breath catch, both at the beauty of it and at the reality settling over her like a heavy coat. This was not just a house. This was the life she had just agreed to pretend to share. As the car came to a stop, Alexander turned to her one last time before the doors opened, and the staff appeared to greet them. "Whatever happens in there," he said quietly, "remember that none of it is real. That is the only way this works." Alina nodded, even as something inside her quietly wondered if he was reminding himself as much as he was reminding her. The car door opened, and sunlight poured in, and there was no more time to think, only to step out and become, for the next 30 days, the Duchess of Ravensworth. She took his offered hand, feeling the strength in his grip, and together they walked toward the manor's grand entrance. Toward a house full of strangers who would soon call her family, and toward a lie that already felt more complicated than either of them had planned. The staff lined the entrance hall in 2 neat rows, and Alina felt every pair of eyes settle on her as she stepped through the tall doors. A tall, silver-haired man stepped forward first, his expression warm but curious. "Welcome home, Your Grace," he said to Alexander, then turned to Alina with a small bow. "And welcome to Ravensworth, my lady. I am Henry, head of household. If you need anything at all, you need only ask." "Thank you, Henry," Alina said, hoping her smile looked more natural than it felt. Alexander guided her through introductions to the rest of the staff, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back in a gesture that looked effortless but made Alina's pulse jump every time. She reminded herself, again and again, that this was performance, nothing more. It was not until they reached the privacy of a long gallery upstairs, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, that Alexander finally exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath since the car door opened. "That went well," he said. "Did it?" Alina asked. "I nearly forgot my own name twice." "You did better than most would," he said, "though we will need to work on a few details. My family will visit within the week and they will ask questions, small things, how we met, what I first noticed about you, the kind of things real couples know without thinking." Alina crossed her arms. "Then we should probably invent those things now, before someone catches us out." Alexander nodded, gesturing toward a door at the end of the gallery. "My study, we can work there." The study was exactly what Alina had expected from a man like him, all dark wood and leather-bound books, a fireplace crackling even though it was not particularly cold. She sat across from him at a wide desk, feeling suddenly like she was being interviewed for a job rather than settling into a marriage, fake or not. "Let's start simple," Alexander said, opening a leather notebook and clicking a pen. "Where did we meet?" "A flower shop," Alina said immediately. "It's the only story I could tell without stumbling. You could say you came in for your grandmother's birthday, and I helped you pick something because you clearly had no idea what you were doing." For the first time since she had met him, Alexander actually laughed, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch him off guard as much as it did her. "That is disturbingly accurate. I would have no idea what to buy." "See," Alina said, unable to stop her own smile. "Already easier than pretending you're some kind of romantic expert." They spent the next hour building a story together, piece by piece, until it felt less like a lie and more like a strange kind of collaboration. Alina found herself relaxing, forgetting for stretches at a time that any of this was invented at all. Alexander, too, seemed to soften as the afternoon wore on, his sharp edges dulling into something more human, more approachable. "What was your childhood like?" she asked at one point, genuinely curious now rather than simply gathering material for their story. Alexander's expression shifted, the warmth retreating slightly. "Formal, distant. My parents believed love was a weakness that complicated arrangements better handled with logic. They were married for appearances, much like we are now, only they never told anyone the truth." "That sounds lonely," Alina said quietly. "It was practical," Alexander corrected, though his voice lacked conviction. "I learned early that people who let themselves feel too much end up disappointed, or controlled, or both." Alina did not push further, sensing the wall he had built brick by brick over a lifetime, but something in her chest ached at the thought of a boy growing up in a house so grand and so empty of real affection. Their first true test came 3 days later, when Alexander's aunt, Charlotte, arrived unannounced for tea, accompanied by her sharp-eyed daughter, who studied Alina with the same intensity as a detective examining a crime scene. "So you're the one who finally caught our elusive Duke," Charlotte said, settling into a high-backed chair in the drawing room, her tone pleasant but probing. "Tell me everything. How did you two meet?" Alina felt her pulse quicken, but she smiled, reaching for the story they had built together. It was actually quite ordinary. I own a flower shop, and Alexander came in looking hopelessly out of his depth, trying to find something for his grandmother's birthday. Hopelessly out of his depth, Alexander repeated dryly, settling beside her on the sofa, his arm draping naturally over the back of it, close enough that Alina could feel the warmth of him. She is exaggerating only slightly. Charlotte's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion exactly, but with the sharp attention of someone who had watched her nephew avoid every possible relationship for years. And you fell for her that quickly. I fell for her honesty, Alexander said, and something about the way he said it made Alina's breath catch, because it did not sound entirely rehearsed. She told me my flower choice was terrible, and that I clearly did not know my own grandmother very well. No one had spoken to me like that in years. Charlotte laughed, a genuine, surprised sound. Well, that certainly sounds like something that would catch your attention. You've always hated people who agree with everything you say. The conversation continued for another hour, weaving between careful questions and easy laughter, and by the time Charlotte finally rose to leave, she embraced Alina warmly at the door. I am glad he found someone who challenges him, she said. For years I worried he would end up as cold as his father. You've clearly cracked something open in him. Alina smiled, thanking her, though the words settled heavily in her chest as she watched the car disappear down the long drive. It was becoming harder to remember moment by moment that any of this was pretend. That evening, Alexander found Alina in the manor's garden, standing among the roses that climbed along an old stone wall, the sky above painted in deep shades of orange and purple. You handled Charlotte well, he said, coming to stand beside her. She's sharp, Alina said. For a moment I thought she saw straight through us. She almost did, Alexander admitted. You saved us both. Alina turned to look at him, the fading light softening the usual severity of his features. Can I ask you something? What you said about my honesty, was that part of the story we built or something else? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the roses rather than on her. I am not entirely certain anymore, he said finally, and the admission seemed to cost him something. You are the first person in a long time who has spoken to me without trying to manage me or flatter me or extract something from me. It is disorienting. Is that a compliment or a complaint? Alina asked, trying to lighten the sudden weight in the air between them. I have not decided yet, Alexander said, and this time the smile that crossed his face reached his eyes, softening him in a way Alina had not seen before. They stood together in comfortable silence as the sun dropped below the horizon, and for the first time since arriving at Ravensworth, Alina felt something shift inside her chest, something warm and unfamiliar and entirely unplanned. Over the following days, their rehearsed intimacy began to feel less like performance and more like habit. Alexander started seeking her out in the mornings before his meetings, bringing her coffee exactly the way she liked it after only being told once. Alina found herself lingering in the study in the evenings, not because their story needed refining, but because she liked the quiet company of a man who was slowly, carefully, letting his guard down. The turning point came on the night of a formal dinner Alexander's lawyer had insisted upon, meant to solidify the marriage in the eyes of the family and the estate's board of trustees. Alina wore a deep blue gown that Grace had chosen for her, her hair swept up in a style that made her feel like a stranger in the mirror, someone far more polished than the florist who had answered a stranger's phone call weeks earlier. The dining room was filled with unfamiliar faces, distant relatives and estate officials who watched the new Duchess with open curiosity. Alina felt Alexander's hand find hers beneath the table more than once throughout the evening, a small, steadying gesture that she had come to recognize as reassurance rather than performance. It was Charlotte, again, who created the moment that changed everything. Near the end of the evening, she rose with a glass of wine in hand, addressing the table with a fond, teasing smile directed at the newlyweds. "I have watched my nephew avoid love for most of his adult life," she announced, drawing laughter and knowing looks from the other guests. "So indulge an old woman and give us a proper kiss, the kind that convinces the rest of us this marriage is as real as it looks." The table erupted in encouraging applause, and Alina felt her face flush with heat, her heart hammering against her ribs. Beside her, Alexander went still for the briefest moment, and she wondered if he would find some clever way to deflect the request, the way he had deflected every uncomfortable moment since she had known him. Instead, he turned to her, his gray eyes searching hers with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "Is this all right?" he asked quietly so only she could hear. Alina, unable to trust her own voice, simply nodded. Alexander's hand rose to cup her jaw, gentle and deliberate, and then his lips met hers in a kiss that was nothing like the polite, performative gesture the table had expected. It was slow and careful and utterly consuming, and for the length of it, Alina forgot entirely that they were surrounded by an audience, forgot the contract, forgot the 30 days ticking down toward an ending neither of them had planned for. When they finally parted, the table burst into applause and laughter, but Alina barely heard it. She was looking at Alexander, and Alexander was looking at her, and something unspoken passed between them that neither one of them was ready to name. Later that night, long after the guests had gone and the manor had settled into silence, Alina lay awake in the grand bedroom she had been given, staring at the ceiling, her fingers pressed to her lips as if she could still feel the warmth of him there. Down the hall in his own quarters, Alexander sat by the window, staring out at the dark gardens, replaying the moment over and over, trying and failing to convince himself that the kiss had meant nothing at all. For a man who had spent his entire life avoiding exactly this kind of complication, he found himself, for the first time, unwilling to regret it. Morning brought a strange new awkwardness between them, not unpleasant, but charged, as though the air in every room had grown thicker overnight. Alina found Alexander in the breakfast room, already dressed for the day, a cup of coffee prepared and waiting for her at her usual seat, exactly the way she liked it. "Good morning," he said, his voice carefully even, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary. "Morning," Alina replied, sitting down and wrapping her hands around the warm cup, grateful for something to hold onto. "About last night." "We do not need to discuss it," Alexander said quickly, and Alina could not decide if she was relieved or disappointed. "I think we do," she said anyway, surprising herself with her own boldness. "That kiss was not part of the plan." Alexander set down his own cup, his jaw tightening slightly. "No, it was not." "So what do we do about it?" He was quiet for a long moment, and Alina watched him wage some internal battle behind those composed gray eyes. "I do not know," he admitted finally. "I have spent my entire life ensuring that nothing catches me off guard. You seem to have made a habit of it." Despite herself, Alina smiled. "I'll take that as a compliment." "You should," Alexander said, and the corner of his mouth lifted in something that was almost, but not quite, a real smile. They settled into an unspoken agreement to let the moment exist without examining it too closely, though it changed the texture of everything between them. Their mornings became something Alina looked forward to, quiet conversations over coffee that stretched longer each day. Their evenings, once filled with rehearsed details about a fictional courtship, became filled instead with real stories, real laughter, real silences that no longer felt uncomfortable. Alina began to learn the smaller truths of the man she had married. That he read late into the night because sleep rarely came easily to him. That he kept a single photograph of his mother in his desk drawer, taken before she had grown as cold and distant as his father demanded. That beneath the composed exterior lived someone who had spent his whole life being told that love was a liability, and who had believed it so thoroughly that he had never once allowed himself to test the theory. "Why do you keep it hidden?" Alina asked one evening, finding the photograph while helping him search for a misplaced document in his desk. Alexander took the photograph gently from her hands, his thumb brushing over the edge of it. "Because it reminds me of who she was before she became what my father needed her to be. I do not like being reminded of what happens to people who let themselves care too much in this family." "Is that what you think happens to everyone who loves?" Alina asked softly. "It is what happened to my parents," he said. "My mother loved my father once, genuinely. By the time I was old enough to understand what I was watching, there was nothing left of that love except two people performing a marriage for the sake of appearances, much like ours." "Ours doesn't have to end that way," Alina said before she could stop herself. Alexander looked up at her sharply, something vulnerable flickering across his face before the familiar composure settled back into place. "Ours has an ending built into it already, Alina. 30 days, and then you take your money and return to your life." The reminder landed like a stone in Alina's chest, and she realized with startling clarity that somewhere in the last 2 weeks, she had stopped thinking of the 30 days as a deadline to survive and started thinking of them as time she did not want to end. "Right," she said quietly, setting the photograph back in its drawer. 30 days. She left the study that night with her chest tight and her thoughts tangled, unable to shake the growing certainty that she was falling for a man who had built his entire life around the belief that falling for anyone was a mistake. Despite the reminder, the days that followed only deepened whatever was growing between them. Alina began spending her mornings in the manor's overgrown greenhouse, coaxing life back into flower beds that had been neglected for years, finding a strange comfort in dirt beneath her fingernails and the familiar scent of soil and green growing things. Alexander found her there one afternoon, sleeves rolled up, hair falling loose from its pins, utterly absorbed in her work. "You could hire someone for this," he said, leaning against the doorway, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "I like doing it myself," Alina said, not looking up from the rose bush she was pruning. "It reminds me of the shop, of my mother." "Tell me about her," Alexander said, surprising her by settling onto an overturned crate beside the flower beds, rather than retreating back to whatever business had brought him searching for her. Alina sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. "She raised the shop from nothing after my father left, worked every single day, even when she was too tired to stand, because she loved it more than almost anything. She used to say that flowers were proof that beautiful things could grow even in difficult soil." "She sounds like she was remarkable," Alexander said quietly. "She was," Alina said, her voice catching slightly. "She died 2 years ago and the shop has been struggling ever since. I have been trying to keep it alive because it feels like keeping her alive, if that makes any sense." "It makes perfect sense," Alexander said, and something in his tone told Alina he understood loss in a way that went beyond polite sympathy. They sat together in the quiet greenhouse for a long while after that, neither one speaking, simply existing in each other's company in a way that felt easier and more natural than anything Alina had experienced in years. When Alexander finally rose to leave, he paused beside her, his hand brushing hers as he helped her to her feet. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For reminding me that difficult soil can still grow something beautiful," he said, and then, as if embarrassed by his own sincerity, he turned and left the greenhouse before Alina could respond. She stood alone among the roses for a long time after he had gone, her heart pounding, fully aware now that whatever she was feeling for Alexander Ashworth had grown far beyond anything a contract could contain. Their closeness did not go unnoticed. Grace, who had become something of a friend to Alina over the past weeks, cornered her one afternoon in the manor's east wing, a knowing look on her face. "You two are different lately," Grace said, folding a stack of freshly pressed linens. "Different how?" Alina asked, though she suspected she already knew. "He smiles more," Grace said simply. I have worked for the Ashworth family for 6 years, and I do not think I had ever seen the Duke smile before you arrived. Now I catch him doing it when he thinks no one is watching. Alina felt warmth rise in her cheeks. We're just settling into things. Grace gave her a look that suggested she did not believe that for a second, but she let the subject drop, offering only a knowing smile before returning to her work. That evening, a storm rolled in over the estate, thunder rattling the tall windows of the manor as rain lashed against the glass. Alina found herself unable to sleep, the storm stirring an old, familiar restlessness in her chest, and she wandered down to the study, drawn by the flickering light beneath the door. Alexander was there, as she had suspected, seated by the fire with a book open in his lap, though his eyes were fixed on the storm outside rather than the pages in front of him. Can't sleep either, Alina asked, stepping into the room. Storms remind me of things I would rather forget, Alexander said, setting the book aside. Sit with me. Alina settled into the chair across from him, the fire casting warm light across both their faces. What kind of things? The night my mother left, Alexander said quietly. There was a storm just like this one. I was 12. She stood in the doorway of my room, told me she loved me, and then she was gone. My father told everyone she had died of an illness. It was easier than explaining that she had simply given up. Alexander, Alina said softly, I am so sorry. I do not need sympathy, he said, though the sharpness in his voice lacked its usual edge. I need you to understand why I built the life I built, why I promised myself I would never let anyone close enough to leave me the way she did. Alina moved from her chair to kneel beside him, taking his hand in both of hers. I'm not going to disappear in the middle of a storm, Alexander. You have 30 days, he said, his voice rough, and then you will disappear regardless, storm or no storm. Maybe I don't want to anymore, Alina said, the words leaving her before she could stop them, honest and unguarded in a way she had not intended to be. Alexander looked at her then, really looked at her, the fire reflected in his gray eyes, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the rain against the windows and the crackling fire between them. Alina, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, I do not know how to do this. I do not know how to let someone stay. Then let me teach you, she said, and when he leaned forward this time, there was no audience to perform for, no contract demanding the gesture, only two people finally admitting what had been growing between them since the moment their hands first touched outside a courthouse weeks earlier. The kiss that followed was nothing like the one at the dinner table. It was slower, more certain, carrying the weight of every honest conversation and quiet morning that had led them to this moment. When they finally parted, Alexander rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. This complicates everything, he murmured. Good, Alina whispered back. I was getting tired of things being simple. Outside, the storm continued to rage against the windows, but inside the study, warmed by firelight and finally honest with each other, Alina and Alexander sat together long into the night, neither one willing to be the first to move away. They did not speak of endings again that night, though the truth of the 30-day deadline sat quietly between them, a shadow neither one wanted to acknowledge. For the first time since arriving at Ravensworth, Alina allowed herself to imagine a version of this story that did not end with her walking away, and though she knew it was dangerous to hope, she found she could not stop herself from wanting it anyway. Alexander, for his part, spent the following days in quiet turmoil, torn between the careful walls he had spent a lifetime building and the growing certainty that Alina Whitfield had already found her way past every single one of them. He began to understand, slowly and reluctantly, that the contract they had signed had never truly accounted for the possibility that pretend feelings might grow into something entirely real. Nathaniel Ashworth had never accepted defeat easily, and the sudden appearance of a wife he had never heard of, appearing mere days before his cousin's deadline, struck him as far too convenient to be genuine. He had watched Alexander avoid every arranged introduction, every hopeful society mother, every carefully engineered meeting for years. A whirlwind romance with a florist from the city felt less like love and more like desperation, and Nathaniel intended to prove it. He hired a private investigator, a quiet, efficient man named Edmund Carver, and gave him one simple instruction: find the truth, whatever it costs. It did not take Edmund long. Bank records showed a substantial transfer from Alexander's personal accounts to Aliner's, timed suspiciously close to the wedding. A clerk at the registry office, easily persuaded with a generous tip, confirmed that the marriage had been arranged with unusual haste. No guests, no announcement, no history of the couple having been seen together before that single day. Piece by piece, Edmund assembled a file that told a very different story than the one Alexander and Aliner had so carefully constructed. Nathaniel read the file with grim satisfaction, already imagining the moment he would present it to the family lawyer, to the board of trustees, to every relative who had been charmed by Aliner's warmth at that first dinner. The marriage would be exposed as fraud, the will's conditions unmet, and the estate would pass to him exactly as he had always believed it should. He chose to reveal his findings at the estate's annual charity gala, an event that drew every important member of society, every trustee, every relative with a stake in the family's fortune. It was, he decided, the perfect stage for Alexander's downfall. Aliner spent the afternoon before the gala in a state of nervous excitement she had not expected to feel. In the weeks since the storm, things between her and Alexander had grown steadily warmer, quiet touches becoming natural rather than performed, private smiles exchanged across crowded rooms that had nothing to do with convincing anyone else. She had begun to believe, cautiously, that whatever they had found together might survive beyond the 30 days. "You look beautiful," Alexander said, finding her in front of the mirror as Grace finished fastening the clasp of a necklace at her throat. "You have to say that," Aliner teased, meeting his eyes in the reflection. "I do not have to say anything," Alexander said, stepping closer, his hands settling on her shoulders. "I choose to say it because it is true." Aliner turned to face him, her heart full in a way she had never quite experienced before. "Alexander, whatever happens after this, tonight or after the 30 days. Do not," he said gently, pressing a finger to her lips. "Not tonight. Tonight, let us simply enjoy being exactly what everyone believes us to be." She nodded, though a small, unshakable unease lingered beneath her happiness, a feeling she could not quite name but could not ignore either. The gala was a glittering affair, chandeliers throwing golden light across a ballroom filled with silk gowns and polished conversation. Aliner moved through the crowd on Alexander's arm, greeting relatives and trustees with the ease of someone who had genuinely fallen into this life rather than simply performed it. And for the first hour, everything felt perfect. It was Nathaniel who shattered it. He waited until the room had gathered near the center for the evening's toasts, until Alexander stood beside Aliner with a glass raised, until every important eye in the county was watching. Then he stepped forward, a folder in hand, his expression carefully arranged into something like regretful concern. "Before we celebrate further," Nathaniel announced, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet room, "I think everyone deserves to know the truth about this marriage." Alexander's expression hardened instantly, his glass lowering. "Nathaniel, this is not the time." "On the contrary, cousin, I believe it is exactly the time," Nathaniel said, opening the folder for effect. "A payment of £30,000 transferred from your accounts to Miss Whitfield's mere days before your sudden marriage. A wedding with no guests, no history. No evidence of any relationship before the day you signed the papers. Tell me, Alexander, is any of what you told this family actually true?" A murmur rippled through the crowd, shocked whispers spreading like fire through dry grass. Alina felt the blood drain from her face, felt every eye in the room shift toward her, searching for the truth in her expression. "That is a private financial matter," Alexander said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "and it has nothing to do with the sincerity of this marriage." "Does it not?" Nathaniel pressed, clearly enjoying the unraveling spectacle. "Because it looks remarkably like you paid a stranger to save your inheritance, Alexander. It looks like every person in this room, myself included, has been made a fool of." Alina's mind raced, searching desperately for something to say that would fix the unraveling moment, but the truth sat heavy and undeniable between them. The payment had been real. The arrangement had been exactly what Nathaniel described, at least in the beginning. "He is not entirely wrong," Alina said finally, her voice trembling but clear enough to carry. The room fell into stunned silence. "The marriage began as an arrangement. I needed money to save my mother's shop. Alexander needed a wife to save his inheritance. That much is true." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and she saw Charlotte's face fall, saw the shock and hurt in the eyes of people who had welcomed her so warmly weeks earlier. "But it stopped being an arrangement a long time ago," Alina continued, turning to look directly at Alexander, whose expression had shifted from anger to something far more vulnerable. "Whatever it started as, it became real, to me at least." The words hung in the air, and Alexander, caught between the collapse of his careful plan and the raw honesty of Alina's declaration, said nothing at all. The silence stretched, unbearable, until Nathaniel filled it with a satisfied, cutting smile. "How touching," he said. "Unfortunately, sentiment does not satisfy the terms of my grandmother's will. A marriage built on payment is not a marriage built on genuine intent, and I intend to challenge its legitimacy with the estate's legal counsel first thing tomorrow morning." He turned and left the ballroom, trailing whispers and scandal behind him, and the carefully constructed evening dissolved into chaos. Guests murmuring, trustees exchanging worried glances, the golden warmth of the gala replaced entirely by cold uncertainty. Alina searched Alexander's face for some sign of reassurance, some acknowledgement of what she had just admitted in front of everyone he knew, but he remained silent, his jaw tight, his eyes distant in a way that frightened her more than Nathaniel's accusations ever could. "Alexander," she said quietly, once they had retreated to the relative privacy of a side hallway, "say something." "What would you have me say?" he asked, his voice strained. "That you just confirmed every suspicion my cousin has spent weeks trying to prove, in front of the very people whose support I need to keep my family's estate." "I told the truth," Alina said, hurt creeping into her voice. "I thought that mattered to you." "It does," Alexander said, running a hand through his hair. "But the timing, Alina, the timing could not have been worse." The words landed like a blow, and Alina felt something inside her go cold and quiet. She had just stood in front of a room full of strangers and admitted publicly that her feelings for him were real, and his only response was concern over timing. "I see," she said, her voice suddenly flat. "For a moment there, I forgot this was still a business arrangement to you." "That is not what I meant," Alexander said, but Alina was already stepping back from him, the warmth of the past weeks curdling into something that felt dangerously close to humiliation. "Isn't it?" she asked. "You have spent your whole life believing that people who care too much end up disappointed. Maybe you were right to believe it." She turned and walked away before he could respond, her heels echoing against the marble floor, past curious guests and worried relatives, out into the cool night air where she could finally breathe without every eye in the county watching her fall apart. Alexander stood frozen in the hallway for a long moment, torn between the instinct to chase after her and the paralyzing fear that had kept him from ever truly letting anyone close. He thought of his mother, disappearing into a storm decades ago. He thought of his father, cold and distant, warning him repeatedly that love was simply a mechanism for eventual loss. And he thought of Alina, standing in front of a room full of strangers, choosing honesty over self-preservation, choosing him, even when it cost her everything. By the time he finally moved, Alina's car was already disappearing down the long drive of Ravensworth Manor, taillights fading into the darkness, and Alexander was left standing alone on the front steps of the estate he had fought so hard to save, wondering if he had just lost the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Inside, Grace found him there some time later, still staring down the empty drive, his composure finally, completely broken. "Your Grace," she said gently, "what happened?" "I let her walk away," Alexander said quietly. After everything she was brave enough to say in front of that entire room, I let her walk away because I was too afraid to say it back. Grace studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. "Then perhaps it is not too late to say it now." Alexander turned to look at her, something resolute settling into his features for the first time since the gala had collapsed into chaos. "Perhaps it is not," he said, and without another word, he strode back into the manor, already forming the plan that would either save everything he had built or lose it entirely. Alina spent the night back at her small apartment above the flower shop, surrounded by the familiar scent of soil and old wood, feeling more lost than she had in years. She had won the shop back, secured the money that would keep her mother's legacy alive, and yet none of it felt like a victory. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the ring still on her finger, unable to bring herself to remove it. Her phone buzzed against the nightstand, and she almost ignored it until she saw Grace's name on the screen. "Alina," Grace said the moment she answered, "you need to come back to the manor, please." "Grace, I don't think." "He hasn't slept," Grace interrupted gently. "He has been in his study all night, and this morning he called an emergency meeting with the trustees and the family lawyer. Whatever he is planning, Alina, I think you should be here for it." Alina sat in silence for a long moment, torn between the hurt still lodged in her chest and the quiet, persistent hope that refused to fully extinguish itself. Finally, she rose, dressed, and drove back toward Ravensworth Manor, uncertain of what she would find when she arrived. The manor was already full of activity when she pulled up the long drive, cars belonging to trustees and family members lining the gravel, Charlotte's familiar vehicle parked prominently near the entrance. Alina hesitated at the door, her heart pounding, before Henry appeared to usher her inside. "They are gathered in the main hall, my lady," he said. "His Grace specifically asked that you be brought in the moment you arrived." Alina followed him through the manor's grand corridors, her nerves building with every step until they reached the main hall, where Alexander stood before an assembled crowd that included the family lawyer, several stern-faced trustees, Charlotte, and standing near the back with an expression of smug anticipation, Nathaniel himself. Every head turned as Alina entered, and Alexander's eyes found hers immediately across the room, something raw and hopeful flickering across his usually composed features. "Alina," he said, stepping forward, "thank you for coming." "What is happening here?" she asked quietly. "I am doing what I should have done last night," Alexander said, turning to address the room at large, his voice steady despite the vulnerability written plainly across his face. "Everyone here has questions about the nature of my marriage, questions my cousin has been quite thorough in raising. I intend to answer them honestly, once and for all." Nathaniel folded his arms, a satisfied smile playing at his lips, clearly anticipating the confession that would finally hand him the estate he had coveted for years. "My cousin is correct that this marriage began as an arrangement," Alexander said, and Alina felt her stomach drop, uncertain where this confession was heading. "I offered Alina payment because I needed a wife within 30 days. And she needed help saving a business that meant everything to her. That much is true, and I will not insult anyone in this room by denying it." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, and Nathaniel's smile widened. But what my cousin does not understand, Alexander continued, his voice growing firmer, more certain, is that an arrangement is not the same as an ending. Somewhere between that first arrangement and this morning, I fell in love with my wife, entirely and without permission from my own careful plans. I have spent my whole life believing that love was a weakness, a mechanism designed to eventually disappoint or abandon the people foolish enough to indulge in it. I believed it because it was easier than risking what my parents lost. But Alina Whitfield walked into a courthouse parking lot as a stranger, and without meaning to, taught me that difficult soil can still grow something beautiful. Alina's eyes filled with tears, her hand rising to her mouth as Alexander crossed the room to stand directly in front of her, ignoring the audience entirely now, his attention fixed solely on her. "I let you walk away last night because I was afraid," he said, his voice dropping, meant only for her though the whole room could hear every word. Afraid that if I admitted how I felt, I would become my father or my mother, someone who loved too deeply and lost everything because of it. But watching you leave taught me something far worse than that fear. It taught me that losing you was infinitely more painful than the risk of loving you ever could be. "Alexander," Alina whispered, tears slipping freely down her cheeks now. "I'm not asking you to stay because of a contract, or 30 days, or an inheritance," Alexander said, sinking to one knee in front of the entire assembled crowd. The same ring he had placed on her finger weeks earlier now held gently between his fingers as he took her hand. "I am asking you to stay because I love you, completely and honestly, and because whatever life looks like from this point forward, I do not want to live it without you in it. Alina Whitfield, will you choose to stay, not because a piece of paper demands it, but because you want to?" The room had fallen completely silent, even Nathaniel momentarily stunned into stillness, his carefully constructed plan crumbling in the face of a confession no one had anticipated. Alina looked down at Alexander, at the man who had spent his entire life building walls against exactly this kind of vulnerability, now kneeling before her with nothing left to hide. "I have one condition," Alina said, her voice steady despite her tears. "Anything," Alexander said immediately. "No more secrets," she said. "No more arrangements or performances or careful stories built to satisfy an audience. If we do this, we do it honestly, as equals, starting today." "Agreed," Alexander said, rising to his feet and pulling her gently into his arms. "Completely and forever." The room erupted into applause, Charlotte openly weeping with joy, several trustees exchanging relieved smiles, and even the family lawyer nodding with quiet satisfaction as he made a note that the marriage, whatever its origins, was undeniably, unmistakably real. Nathaniel, recognizing his defeat, quietly slipped from the room without another word, his months of scheming undone by a single honest confession. In the weeks that followed, Alexander and Alina chose to hold a second ceremony, smaller than the grand society weddings the estate typically demanded, held instead in the greenhouse where Alina had first begun to fall for the quiet, guarded man beneath the Duke's composed exterior. Roses climbed the stone walls around them, flowers Alina herself had coaxed back to life from years of neglect, proof, as her mother always used to say, that beautiful things could grow even in the most difficult soil. Charlotte stood as witness, tears in her eyes as she watched her nephew exchange vows that carried no trace of performance or obligation, only genuine, hard-won love. Grace stood nearby, beaming with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had watched the entire transformation unfold from the very beginning. Even Henry, ever composed, allowed himself a rare, genuine smile as the couple exchanged rings for the second time, this time with nothing false standing between them. "I love you," Alexander said quietly, as they stood together beneath the greenhouse's glass ceiling, sunlight pouring down around them. "Not because of any arrangement or any deadline or any inheritance, simply because you are you, and because you taught me that love is not the weakness I always believed it to be." "I love you too," Alina said, smiling up at him, The flower shop's ring finally replaced by one chosen freely, honestly, without a single condition attached. Difficult soil and all. As they kissed beneath the greenhouse glass, surrounded by roses that had once been forgotten and were now, like the two of them, thriving in ways neither had thought possible, Alina understood that the 30 days that had once felt like a desperate bargain had become, instead, the beginning of an entirely real and unexpected life. The shop was saved, the estate secured, and more importantly than either, two guarded hearts had finally found their way to something neither had believed they deserved. A love built not on necessity, but on truth, patience, and the quiet, stubborn hope that even the coldest walls could eventually be warmed by someone brave enough to stay.